So, I bet you've been to maybe a parent-teacher conference recently, or you've gotten your first progress report for the school year. And it may or may not have data on it. It may or not have line graphs and bar graphs. And maybe when you were at the parent-teacher conference, your teacher showed you your child's state test scores. And there were bar graphs and there were paragraphs and there were like all kinds of things. And maybe you walked away knowing your child is average, below average, or above average. And that's about all those test scores showed you, right? Not really helpful. Or on your progress report, do you see again maybe some line graphs with dotted lines and red solid lines? And it's like, okay, so what does this mean? Well, today we're going to be talking about a lot of times we think more is better, right? However, if we have more data, does that really mean we can make better decisions? Well, only if that data is meaningful, right? So today we're going to be talking about the volumes of data that it seems like teachers are collecting now. But is it because they're told to collect this, that it's more of a compliance move than it is an actual time to be able to discuss real specific things with parents or with fellow teachers? Probably not. So we're going to be looking at 5 signs that there's some trouble brewing there with your data. One of the signs is that you only have that data. There's no paragraph or no verbal explanation to you about what that data means. And that's what we're going to be looking at, because just having a bunch of numbers or a bunch of symbols really doesn't tell you much, and it probably doesn't tell other teachers much either. Now, another example that you might have seen is you might have that progress monitoring data, and you might see the line pretty straight the whole time, or you might see a line going down, you might see a line going up, and it's confusing, but I don't know. It's like, do you just stay quiet because it's like, I don't want to ask a dumb question? But all of those points on that line graph and the direction that the lines are going should have meaning, and the teacher should be able to explain to you. Because if you have a progress monitoring graph and the line is pretty flat, that usually means that your child is staying at the same point. He's not losing skills, but he's also not gaining skills. So that's something that you want to look at and you want to ask questions about. A third red flag is what I call just junk data. And sometimes we see this when teachers are collecting behavior data. And sometimes it's just, I really like to see the raw data, like the date, what happened, what the teacher said, what the child said, whatever, like really concrete data. But instead, sometimes you see a Y, an N, a plus, a minus, a zero, and it's like, how can anybody interpret that data when there's really no logic to it, no pattern, no background understanding? So if you are seeing, especially behavior data that just has these notations, but not really any interpretation, again, that is one of your red flags, your sign. I think this is trying to see if I'm going to pay attention today. A fourth sign is that, again, you have scores for reading, you have scores for math, you have scores for written language, but it's like, well, what are the exact skills that my child can do in reading or is having trouble in reading? Just this global reading score isn't going to help you. It isn't going to help the staff to measure, is the child making progress? Do we have to change anything with our instructional strategies? So pay attention if you have test scores and there's no skills that are associated with that test score. Now, a fifth sign that you don't have great data is when you ask at the IEP meeting, like, what does this mean? How is that going to help me as a parent at home with my child's homework? How is this information going to help the teacher? And you just hear crickets and nobody has an answer. And they might go back to, well, this report that has this computerized printout, but that computerized printout doesn't have that personal, individualized interpretation. Yeah, this is what that test is supposed to measure, but now that you gave me the score, what does this really mean? And if nobody can answer that, where's my red flag? That's a big red flag, right? So, what are some of the problems? I see, because when I go as an advocate to parents to IEP meetings, often I'm sitting right next to them. The staff will pass out a bunch of paper, and the parent will look at this data that they're given, and it looks official. And it's like, well, I don't know. This must be how they do progress reports. And they sit there quietly, right? And they assume that it's meaningful, but it really isn't. And it's kind of like the emperor with the new clothes. Like, we have to call that out. And the mistake that I see is that when parents stay quiet, um, because they figure, well, everybody else is like moving on with the next set of pages or whatever. I must be the only one here that doesn't get this. And that's not true. So, another problem that we have is you don't know what you don't know, right? So, it's like, what question would you even ask when they give you these data collection sheets or these progress monitoring graphs? It's like, you wouldn't even know what to ask, right? And that's not your fault. So don't do that to yourself. Um, so, um, and the mistake, I think, even though we don't know what those questions are, maybe that we should be asking, is you figure if the staff's not talking anymore about it, they've given you the information and you're moving on. So the mistake is assuming that the staff has already told you everything that you need to know about your child and if they're making progress, if they're not making progress, things like that. So, an additional problem that I often see is believing that what you get is what you get. I don't know. This is what my progress reports always look like. This is what it always looks like when I ask for behavior data. This is the kind of stuff I see. Well, the mistake there is that you leave the meeting just completely dazed. You don't have an understanding. You can't go home and explain this to your husband, your partner. It's like you leave and it's like, well, I don't know. I don't know what happened here. So that can be distressful, right? So what we can do instead are ask more poignant questions. So a first question that you could ask is, what does this data tell us? And then you're quiet and you wait. And you really are expecting somebody to explain what this means. Another question that's a good one to ask is, what changed when we saw that line on the progress report dip and go down? Because we don't want people just like blindly collecting this data, plotting it on a graph, and like checking off a box. Collect data, yep, did that. And it's like, no, look at this. Like, why is the line going down? Doesn't that mean my child isn't learning as much, isn't making as much progress? Um, so, what I really hope that you'll walk away with from today is it's okay to ask questions when you're at IEP meetings. It's okay to say, is there another way you can explain this? I'm not sure what all these numbers mean. Because that's the purpose of being there at that meeting, is to collaborate, to have discussions. So if you're not understanding what they're putting down, you need to take a deep breath and ask some questions. Now, another question that you can ask is, does the data tell us what is and what isn't working? Because we collect data to help us make decisions. And one of the big decisions that we make from data is, are my instructional strategies as a teacher working with this child? Do I see that line going up? Do I see them gaining skills? What skills do I see them gaining? What skills do they still need to develop? So data isn't just because, the federal government, the state government told you to collect data. Data is there to tell us a story. And there is a story behind those numbers and dots and lines. And that's what we want to hear when we go to meetings. So a fourth question that you can ask is, how does this data help my child's teacher know their strengths? Because another thing that I see a lot is that, you know, we're looking at like, what doesn't the child know? What are some areas of need that we can write an IEP goal? Instead, I want to know those areas of need when I look at data. However, I also want to look at those test scores. I also want to look at what the school psychologist gave. And I want to be a detective and say, what are the strengths that we can pull out from this information? Because when we know your child's strengths, then we can build on them. So we want the data to also talk about what your child already knows, how we can build on that. And a final question that's a good one to ask is, well, now that we have this data, what does that mean for our next step? It's like, how are we going to, proceed? Are we going to say what we're doing is really making a difference in reading class, so we want to keep doing that? Are we noticing that in social studies, when the child watches a video before they read the information, they have much more background and it really helps them? what are we going to do next because of this data? And it's not just like, well, we'll wait till next quarter and see how your child's doing. So I hope the next time you get a progress report, the next time you go to a parent-teacher conference, that you will feel empowered to go ahead and speak up and ask questions, because there's a story behind those numbers. It's a story about your child. It's a story about how they learn best, the challenges that they still have, those missing skills. And it's also a story of celebration, so we can talk about the progress, the advancements that your child has made. And that's what we want to be able to celebrate, right? So don't accept junk data that doesn't mean anything, especially when you ask the person that gave you that sheet with the junk data, what does this tell me? What does this mean for my child? So I am Charmaine Tanner. I am thrilled that I can help support parents, because my passion is to make sure that all students are safe, happy, and learning every day at school. So until next time, take care and keep on keeping on.